Well, let's do this. Let's go ahead and jump on in. We'll make a quick couple of intros here while other people continue to jump on in. I am Todd White. I'm the co-founder of Guide CX. We focus primarily on software implementations. What we do is we provide, think about it like a customer-facing project management tool, specifically to engage external parties and make things as seamless as humanly possible when there's a new customer onboarding. That's what we do. That's what we love. And would love to introduce a very good friend of mine, John. John is coming to us from Nashville. I've met John just along the way at different conferences, and we've presented a couple of times together. He is the CEO of SOAR Performance Group. They do an amazing job of helping people just with the bicycle, with customer engagement, and has a wealth of knowledge working from large companies, some of the fastest growing companies, some of the Fortune 500 companies. So it is an honor to be able to steal a little bit of time from John and get what he's seen out there in the market today. So we appreciate it.
Awesome.
John, don't know if you want to add anything else about SOAR Performance, though.
We'll have a little time to chat about us later. We've got a slide in there. We'll do a quick overview, but that was a perfect tee up, and I really appreciate it, Todd. And always happy to spend time together with you. So I've enjoyed getting to know you, enjoyed getting to know Guide CX, and really appreciate the opportunity to be together with the group today. So we'll dive right in as we go through. One of the things I was going to mention, Todd and I were talking about this yesterday when we were getting prepped. Like as we go through, we're going to talk about. Really, today's topic is on how do we use onboarding, and Todd, all the great things that you all do in terms of automating the onboarding process, making it easy for people to manage their customers through that onboarding process. Really want to talk about how to leverage onboarding in your customer onboarding process to drive value realization, because ultimately when we think about onboarding, from our perspective, the purpose of great onboarding is to help make sure our customers see fast time to value that ultimately helps us make sure we retain and expand those customers. And so we're going to talk about some of the best practices that we see in terms of ways to make sure that we leverage that onboarding process, not just as something that we're getting through to get the customer on board, but how do we make sure that that really drives the right value realization so that we can ultimately retain and expand that account. So that's a lot of what we're going to share and talk about today. Just in terms of agenda, we just covered intros, so we've made good progress there. We're going to talk a little bit about customer growth and why that's so important, this year as well as next year. What are some of the trends that are driving customer growth to be a big deal? And as a part of that, one of the things that we see that's a super critical foundation for driving customer growth is creating that great onboarding experience. So that onboarding is oftentimes the first interaction a customer has with us. You'd be amazed how many times when we do win-loss churn analysis with our customers, where when you talk about accounts that have churned, a lot of the things that resulted in them leaving had a lot to do with what happened way back during the onboarding process. And so we'll talk about some of the lessons that we've learned there that can be helpful for folks to make sure you prevent that churn. Similar when we talk with our customers about why have they expanded? Why have they done more with an account? A tremendous amount of the root cause behind that actually goes back to things that happened early on in the customer relationship. And so we'll talk about some of the ways and best practices that we've seen to help make sure that we drive that value realization that ultimately leads to growth and retention. Then we'll have a little time for takeaways and discussion. So one thing I would encourage everybody to do as we go through the conversation today is if you have questions, if there are things that you have questions about, if there are things that we talk about that you say, hey, I want to double click on that, please feel free to drop those in either the Q&A or the chat. It looks like we've got a variety of folks coming to us from both sunny and not so sunny climates today. So thanks everybody for being on board, and we're excited about spending the time together. So just a quick background on us. So we're a consulting and enablement firm that specializes in revenue growth. So really across the full customer life cycle, from landing customers through driving adoption, expansion, retention. We really help our customers build the right processes and the right people capabilities to execute on that, to drive the growth they're looking for in terms of acquiring new customers or growing inside their customer base. And so as a part of that, a lot of the work that we get to do is really optimizing our customers' customer journey, from everything around how they land that account through how they drive adoption, expansion, and retention, which is part of how we've developed a perspective around a lot of the onboarding and how you can leverage that as a strategic lever to help you drive value realization with your customers. So if we step back and just kind of elevate a little bit and say, hey, why is customer growth so critical? When you think about onboarding, part of the reason we believe onboarding is so important is it really sets the foundation for retention and expansion. I mean, all of us have probably been on a date at some point in our lives. Like if your first date doesn't go that well, it's hard to go to date number 2, 3, and 4. And
Yeah.
when we kind of step back and think about onboarding, we really see onboarding as the foundation for how do you drive customer growth. And when you kind of level that up and say, hey, why does customer growth matter? I don't know who here is familiar with the rule of 40, but for anybody that's got in a software oriented business, it basically says, hey, growth plus profit needs to equal, around 40%. And so when we look at that, part of what we've seen is net new logo signings are going down, across the board, pretty much no matter which category of SaaS you look at. New logos have been harder over the past, 2 to 3 years. So that's being driven by a lot of change in buyer behavior. So we're seeing as much as 60 plus longer sales cycles throughout this year compared to 2 years ago. We're also seeing a lot heavier business case scrutiny when we look at, our customers are putting a lot more scrutiny on what is the economic value of purchasing software. There's also been a lot of disruption in terms of software budgets getting displaced by AI budgets or new project budgets. So there's also kind of increased scrutiny there. Secondly, there's a lot of economic advantage to expansion. So if you look at the expansion opportunities, in general, your cost of expansion is going to be somewhere between 4 and 8x. In general, we say 5x as a rule, lower cost than signing a new logo when you look at the total cost of that sale and that transaction. In general, there's also about a 30% higher win rate. So if you look at your cost to grow an existing account, much less than your cost to acquire a new account. Obviously, growing in your customer base has a huge impact on NRR and lifetime value. So
real quick, John,
ahead,
let
Todd.
me double click on that real quick on just on the 5% lower cost.
Yeah.
What are you seeing right now as far as the scrutiny on customer acquisition cost, on just grow at all costs, which we've seen
Yeah.
for a long time in the software world? What are you seeing in that world? Because that 5 times lower cost,
Yep.
that really sticks out, to me.
Yeah, 100%. So one is, if you think about it at a board level, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on, what does our customer acquisition cost look like? I mean, if we look at our customers that are both publicly held and privately funded, the way I'm going to describe it is cost to serve didn't go away as a concept, but everybody kind of forgot about it for a couple of years, and it's definitely come back on the scene in a big way. So I would say across all of our customers, there is way higher scrutiny on cost to serve, and there's a lot of scrutiny on how do they balance resources across customer acquisition and customer growth. So I would say if you go back to 2021, there wasn't a lot of discussion about cost to serve, right? If you think about now, that's a discussion that every one of our customers is having at a board level, and it's making an impact on how they're resourcing too.
It's almost as if the term gross margin just kind of went away.
It went away, and now
years.
it's come back. It's come back in a big way.
Yeah. And to your point here, when you start to see 5 times lower customer acquisition cost, and now the gross margin is being layered in, that is like the critical piece of growth in 2025 is efficient growth.
That's right.
That's the massive. Anyways, keep going.
Huge topic. And then if you think about, to your point on NRR and LTV, like if you don't have a good expand motion, you really run into a ceiling on NRR, right? Like if you're unable to expand your customers over time, your NRR is going to just get hammered. And then NRR, as we've seen over the past several years, has a huge impact in terms of company valuation. So if you look at a lot of the studies that have been done, there's one of the highest correlations between valuation of similar size and growth rate software companies is NRR, which is net revenue retention. So that basically is retention, including expansion, which is, again, a huge driver of valuation. So that's really one of the reasons that we're seeing organizations really focus on customer growth. And part of the reason that we believe onboarding is so important is your onboarding really sets the foundation for all these things that happen afterwards. And if you don't do a good job with onboarding, it's really, really hard to drive a strong customer growth motion.
Yeah, one thing that I've kind of, I don't know if you want to say the word, have preached or have talked about a long time. Evangelized, I think is a good word. Yeah. Is when is that person, when is the transition from a prospect to a customer? And the reality is that's when they sign that contract. Yep. And all things start from the moment that they sign that contract. It's not necessarily when is first utilization, like we're already losing time of building these values with people if you're not starting from the moment that they literally sign that contract.
Yep.
That's when the work begins, not when the product goes live or
Yes.
once we get things moved on down into our CSP and we're working through these platforms. It's before that.
Yeah, 100%. And we'll talk about that in terms of the value realization journey. But my granddad had an asphalt paving company. He used to talk about burning daylight. When we think
Yeah.
about that customer onboarding, we don't want to be burning that daylight from the time we sign that. Every moment from the time, and you've probably seen this in the work you're doing with customers. I mean, people's expectation about go live. I mean, there used to be systems that didn't go live for 2 years at a time, right? Which is in today's world, if you told somebody that, they would, it would be almost a non-starter. And so expectations in terms of go live, time to value, all those things just keep going up. And so to your point, we don't really get the opportunity to, what's the right way to say this, be laissez-faire or lackadaisical or burn daylight about that time from contract signature to when are we receiving value.
No, that's awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah.
That's a huge call out. And so, and this actually dovetails nicely with the point you were just bringing up, which is, the things that you can do that in our experience make a huge difference in using onboarding as a strategic lever for creating value realization. There's 5 core things that we believe are really important. So one is having a good value realization framework. And so we'll talk about this in a moment, but so many of the organizations that we work with, when we start working with them, they don't have a clear roadmap for what is the value we're going to sell pre-sale, what is the first value we expect a customer to get, and then how does that value and outcome grow over time. That roadmap is one of a few things. It's either not well defined or it's been defined in a bunch of different ways. So sales has a version, success has a version, professional services has a version. So if you're a customer, you get a bunch of really different experiences when you go through that journey of signing and then ultimately working with that company. So we'll talk about some things that can help in terms of creating a clear value realization framework, because without that, it's really hard to have a North Star for what is the experience, what is the outcome we want to drive through onboarding. The second is nailing the sales handshake. We used to talk about kind of handoffs. I like this term handshake better because it implies that we're not, nobody likes, if you ask somebody, hey, do you like being handed off? Like I had to resolve something with Delta a few weeks ago and I got handed off about 7 different times. And, I didn't enjoy any of those handoffs particularly. So that handshake, making sure we have a strong handshake with sales. And we'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, but what we see is on this sales handshake, one of 2 things: either it doesn't happen at all and there's very little sort of handoff, or it's an overwrought process that has a ton of technical information, but doesn't actually help with how do we create that great first time to value, that great first outcome, that wow for our customer. Third thing.
Go ahead, Todd. The reality is, and I know, John, you just kind of went through this with a new baby that you had there, but you work with one doctor and then all of a sudden the next one comes in and you're kind of saying to yourself, does that guy know everything that the new lady knows about all this type of stuff? And there can be some fear of, hey, is the transfer going on? And in the reality, you're the customer of the hospital in a way, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, I think that happens with us as well too, where you buy something and it's like, hey, do they know what they just said? Like, I'm trying to get to this spot on top of the mountain. Does everybody know that that's where I'm trying to get to? And I think you can get frustrated as a customer if you see that they don't.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And then the other piece is, especially depending on the complexity of what you're selling, complexity of what you're deploying, there's a lot that can get lost in translation there. And so making sure we've got a good handshake, it makes a huge difference there. The third piece is really about transforming your onboarding process to focus on leading indicator of retention and expansion. And we'll talk a lot about this today because it's something that, while it's incredibly powerful, it's also incredibly underutilized in our customers and the organizations that we work with, which is getting really clear on, hey, when we leave onboarding, when we say, hey, a customer is onboarded, what are the leading indicators that we want to make sure are accomplished that let us know that there is a high likelihood of retention and expansion? And so one of the things when we work on customer success with our customers is getting super clear on, hey, what does what if we know that, for example, somebody sent 2,000 messages or used 5 features or have created 3 priority intelligence requirements, whatever that is, what is it that we know if somebody has exited onboarding and accomplished this, they're likely to retain and expand? And then organizing our onboarding process around helping the customer achieve that before they leave onboarding. And so that's one of the biggest mindset shifts that I see across our customers. When they can nail that, makes a huge difference for the value realization piece.
John, and I don't know if you're going to get into this later, but how far do you see organizations go to these leading indicators? Meaning, are you seeing people that are setting OKRs on the company?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Like
we have company OKRs, like comp on a post sale team, very much tied to that. I mean, we have some customers where you're not allowed to leave onboarding until you get there, like that you literally can't progress out of, it's not possible for someone to leave that phase until they achieve that. I mean, so there's obviously a spectrum, right? But like there's
yeah.
the other part is, depending on how well it's defined, people can get pretty serious about the way they incent, the way they have metrics around it, even just stuff like, I mean, like literally we have a customer, you can't leave onboarding until that happens.
Yeah, so you're seeing even company objectives, you're seeing compensation
Yep.
revolving around this. You're seeing,
Yep.
like to your point, the ability to execute my job will
Yep.
depend on these leading indicators. That to me is a mind shift in
It's
organization.
very transformative.
We're all in.
It's very transformative. But when you do it right, it has huge
Magic.
dividends in terms of expansion and retention, huge dividends. But it's people that do it right, they really go all in on it. But yeah, for sure. Then the last 2 things is balancing what I'm going to call the technical onboarding and the onboarding experience. And again, this depends a little bit on how complex your product is, but something that we see a lot is companies over-index on technically onboarding, under-index on creating a great onboarding experience. And so part of this has to do with the fact that as you get into implementing a customer, and Todd, you see this in the people you work with, right? You're doing a complex implementation. There's a lot of blocking and tackling, a lot of project management that goes into just technically getting everything working. But one of the things we see oftentimes is that people over-rotate on that, forget about how do we create a great experience for someone that creates enthusiasm for them becoming our customer.
Yeah. No, you're
Yeah.
right. And I think about it lots of times, like in a restaurant scenario where you could have the best cooked steak, potatoes,
Oh
and,
yeah.
and everything. But if it comes out on a paper plate with a plastic fork, right, that experience,
Yeah.
the product is
It's
still
not
the
as great.
same, but the experience is horrific. And
Yeah,
that
yeah,
will
yeah.
change the way you perceive it.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And to, in fairness, oftentimes just getting that first piece right in terms of technical onboarding is so hard that people actually just forget about the other pieces.
Yeah,
But our view is that you've really got to balance those 2 things. And
that's a
then,
good point.
the last piece is leveraging tools like GuideCX to automate as many of the routine tasks as you can to allow for more focus on the relationship development. I mean, one of the big things that we see is the more that, and I'll even talk about a real example from our own business. I mean, we've implemented a project management tool, and one of the things that's allowed us to do is send a lot more routine updates to our customers, so that when we're having those project calls with our customers, we don't have to spend 30 minutes going through the project plan. Like, we've got an update, everybody's been updated on what's happened. We can hit the high points on that, but we can spend more time talking about what really matters in terms of advancing their objectives, advancing the work we're doing together. It's been really transformative. And I think when people use tools like GuideCX, it allows you to spend time on those deeper relationship building types of tasks. So with that, we're going to double click a little bit on each one of these things. And, as we mentioned earlier, kind of the first step, which we really see is foundational for, driving value realization through onboarding is really this place. And Todd, you mentioned earlier, between contract signature and our first outcome, onboarding really fits very tightly in how do we prove value of what we have delivered. And so part of our view around onboarding is that onboarding really needs to be about proof of value and proving, here is the value that you bought, here's the value you're going to get. And so one of the big tips that we have for people, or something we share a lot with folks, is if your onboarding process is based off of completion of tasks on our side or completion of tasks on the customer side rather than an outcome, you're likely not going to be driving as much value realization as you can if you have an outcome at the end of that value realization. And our view is that outcome really needs to be your leading indicator of retention and expansion. So we'll talk more about some examples there, but getting really clear on, hey, onboarding is about proving value, and we've got a clear outcome, North Star, that we want to get to at the end of that onboarding process. Super important. However, if we kind of spread that out on each side, it's really hard to do that if we don't have a common framework from how we sell, how we drive expansion, and kind of an integrated language around what are those outcomes we expect that a customer can achieve. How do we measure those outcomes? How do we prove we're on the right path? And I can't tell you how many organizations we work with to build out their value framework, their outcome framework, where it's almost like I had an Aunt Thelma that would knit these really ugly quilts that had like 19 different patches in them. And, you know, a wonderful woman, but like a lot of people's value framework sort of looks like that patchwork quilt. And it's like, hey, sales has a little bit of this thing they do over here. Onboarding has a little bit of this thing they do over here. Customer success has a little bit of this thing they do over here. Account management. But if you ask everybody at the company, hey, what is our customer value journey? You get 19 different answers. And so one thing that we see that's really important if you want to drive value realization, which, look, if you think about why does it matter in terms of driving value realization, if you have a value realization motion, a value-based sales and realization motion, you're going to sell bigger deals. You're going to expand more with your customers. You're going to renew more. Like it's a pretty proven fact. However, these things get implemented in little pockets. So one thing that we would encourage everybody to do is have a clear value framework around, hey, here's the potential outcome and metrics that we want to sell to a customer. Here's the first outcome that we want to deliver coming out of onboarding that we have a clear alignment with our customer on. And then here are the additional outcomes that we want to build off that so that we really have an integrated value journey for that customer where they're getting more outcome, more value as they go through their relationship with us. And again, this is something that, like I said, a lot of people have different ideas around, but if you can really get the entire company on that same songbook, can make a huge difference. That's also part of why I'll do a little commercial for us. I believe there's a lot of value in having an external party to help with this because there's oftentimes many different versions of this that live in different places. Harmonizing that, getting into consistent motion is a really critical first step.
Yeah, I always believe that if you're too close to something or too far away from something, you can't see it.
Exactly. And it's, well, and right, if you think about the chevrons at the top, you know, we all get focused on our little piece of the chevron, but from a customer perspective, they experience the whole thing, right? Like if you're a buyer, you experience the sales process, you experience the onboarding, you experience the ongoing relationship. And so, you know, even though to us, it's these little separate things, to the customer, it's all the same thing. You know, it's all the same thing. Then the next piece, when we talk about nailing the sales handshake, this is intentionally simple for the following reason. There's two things that I see around the sales handshake most commonly in our customers that we work with. Either one, there is no real handshake. It's sort of like contract is signed and then it gets put into a workflow where all of a sudden you're now queued up in onboarding and there's an onboarding meeting. And I literally will never forget, I went to an onboarding meeting for one of our customers, and one of our customers was having an onboarding meeting with their customer, and they were asking all these things that like somebody should have found out during the sales process. I mean, it was like, you know, hey, how many users do you have? What are your primary use cases? You know, so on and so forth. And so that's one extreme that I see a lot, which is we don't really have a good handshake process. So when you start onboarding, you're almost having to start from a fresh slate. The other thing, so we have another customer that's way on the other end. They have this like 54 field form that goes down into like a ton of technical detail about all sorts of different things that their sales engineer fills out, and it gets pushed over to the onboarding team. And it's so much detail that it's actually hard for that onboarding team or that CSM to then have a conversation with the customer about like, hey, what are you really trying to accomplish? Because they're so in the weeds that it's hard for them to figure out, hey, what are we really trying to accomplish with our customer here? So when we think about the sales handshake, we believe there's 5 simple questions that you've got to nail, and there's a lot of other stuff you can roll underneath that. But one is like, this sounds foundational, but what did they buy? I can't tell you how many times that there's a misunderstanding between onboarding and sales about what did this customer actually buy. You know, second, why did they buy it? I would say frequently that is deeply misunderstood. What value are they expecting to get? You know, and when, right? From a customer perspective, what are they looking to get out of this? Who are the key players on the customer side? When are they expecting to realize that value? Like part of our view on this is that getting these very foundational questions nailed as part of your handshake, you can then build on. But if you can't answer these things, it's really hard to then add more technical detail behind it and make it meaningful from a customer engagement perspective.
One thing that I've noticed, John, in this is where do you put these type of questions in the sales process? Because what ends up
Yeah.
happening is if you have a 3-week sales process, then yeah, you're going to remember this stuff as an AE as
Yep.
you're going through it.
Yep.
But when you start
If you have
working
a
large
if you have a
enterprise
3 month,
deals,
6 month, 9 month, yeah.
yeah, like sometimes the second half of that 9-month process, you're not doing anything in the product. You're just navigating through red tape, through
Yeah.
buying pieces. Now all of a sudden, 6 months later, the customer is literally like, I haven't seen this product in 6 months. I can't
Yes.
even remember
And
exactly.
I'm
I
and
knew
I'm
they
and I'm
needed
very
it, but
tired. And I'm very tired from arguing with our procurement people internally.
and that's the reality is I believe like this needs to be in more of the sales rep right earlier on in the sales process than just
Yeah.
close one, which is where I think
Yes.
most people let it sit. And I think that's a
Agreed.
mistake. It needs to be brought up further.
So I actually, to your point, what part of what we see and recommend is that you capture a lot of this type of information in the discovery, in the
Yep.
discovery, maybe proposal phases, because that's where people are thinking about a lot of this stuff. Make sure you've got the information in fields there that can then be pushed to the other side when you get to the end of the process.
Yeah, and whether that's I'm assuming you recommend probably building these fields into a CRM or at least
Yep.
having a form
Yeah,
that
at
build
minimum a
out.
form. I mean, the ideal, like I'll talk about the nirvana state, right? Like the nirvana state is that these are things that go in as you're, working through that stage, and then it just automatically gets pushed to the onboarding team when it goes to close one. That nirvana state, let's say, exists in different levels of maturity depending on how
Yeah.
sophisticated your rev ops teams are, all those sorts of things. But at minimum, ideal thing is you got it all in your CRM. It just gets pushed over. What I see more commonly is a form. And then the other piece that I think becomes a big important piece of this is the do you have a handover meeting or not, right? If you've got a more transactional sale, you probably don't need a handover meeting. If you've got a more enterprisey sale, you probably need to have some sort of a handover meeting between sales and your CS team.
Yeah, we just had a question. Do you see this as a form or in CSM for clients of every size?
Yeah, in general, yes. Let's say, what's the right way to say this? Do I see it in clients of every size? No, I see it aspirationally, yes. Does everyone have it well implemented? No. So, like, I think if you ask most people, this is sort of like working out and eating right. Like, it's like if you ask most people, should eat right and exercise? Everybody says yes. If you then look at what are we eating for dinner on a Thursday, high variability there. So everyone, I would say, wants to have something. I would say it exists in a lot of different formats, is the way I would say it.
Would you say that the larger the deal, the more important this becomes?
100%, right? If you sell, like we have a customer that sells appraisal software for commercial real estate appraisals. Like the outcome that their customer is looking for, right, is pretty consistent. It's pretty, which is how do I do my appraisal reports in a more automated, streamlined, efficient way? Like
Very transactional. Yeah.
there's not that much variability in terms of what is the outcome we're looking for. If we think about something like we have another customer that sells really large transformational cloud software, right? Like their customer outcomes could look a lot different. There's a lot more people involved, technical engineers, solution architects. So the bigger the deal, the more important this is for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. But yeah,
That's
so
a good question. Thank you for that
to the
question.
original question, yeah, and keep the questions coming. To the original question, these are things that certainly, again, they are foundational, but I would say under operationalized in a lot of organizations. Then the next piece is really about establishing your leading indicator of retention and expansion. And we're going to talk through some different examples around this, but establishing a leading indicator of retention and expansion, super important for making onboarding a value realization activity. So if you don't have a leading indicator that you can point to that says, when we get through this activity, we know that this is going to directly correlate to retention and expansion. It's really hard to organize your onboarding process towards that value or outcome approach. So when we think about establishing a leading indicator of retention and expansion, what is that? It's a specific measurable outcome that correlates with accounts where we retain and expand. So if you look at accounts we retain and expand, are there some specific attributes we can look at that connect to that? And I'm going to talk about some different examples that we have from working with our customers. So some different examples.
These are hard to find.
Right. They're hard. The one thing I would say is, like, establishing this requires a concerted effort. Like, this is not something you're going to accidentally stumble across, right? Like, this is something where you're going to really, it requires it requires some concerted effort, and it also requires a good enough understanding of your historical customers to be able to make some correlations there. So if you look at some different examples, right? So if you look at Slack, so I think this is an important distinction here. If you look at Slack, like, there is some level of product virality here where if I use Slack, you use Slack, Todd, and then you and I are Slacking, we add other people to the conversation. There's a level of virality where if we get, enough people using it, it's going to become sticky. And so if you look at Slack, their leading indicator of retention expansion is 2,000 plus messages in the first 30 days. So does somebody have 2,000 or more messages in the first 30 days that they have gone live with Slack? And so everything that they do is about how do we encourage people to send more messages on the platform. So if you have a product, or your organization sells a product that has a high component of virality, or where what I call virality, or where there are compounding effects of usage, then something like volume can be really helpful. Now let's talk about some different examples. Not everybody sells a product where you've got, kind of built-in product virality. If you think about a product like HubSpot, right? And so if you look at HubSpot, and this was for their original product, which was marketing, kind of their website automation marketing product. 5 out of 25 features utilized within the first 60 days. So 60 days when you're live with the platform, if you've utilized at least 5 of their 25 features, you're going to have a high likelihood to retain and expand. So this is a great example of a product where, again, there's not a virality aspect because you're mostly dealing with an admin persona. But if we can get to a certain level of feature utilization, that's going to make a big difference in terms of do we retain or expand. Another organization, so Recorded Future, this is a fascinating example. It's a company, they're in the cybersecurity software space that we have worked with for a long time. And they sell a platform that basically allows you to know what threats are out there that are real threats that you need to be paying attention to. And so when we first worked with them, the only thing they measured was NPS. And I'll never forget our first meeting with Chris Holden, who's our chief customer officer. He said, hey, we have this interesting problem, which is we have super high user NPS, but we also have, relatively speaking, high churn. And so one of the things that they looked at was super high user NPS. People love the platform, but when it came time to talk about budgeting, when it came time to talk about renewal, if they couldn't go back and point to specific security threats that they had made a meaningful difference in tackling, their solution was really easy to churn, really easy to turn off, because you had these users that, hey, we love using it, but then when you get into business value, it sort of becomes this, hey, what's the real value? So part of what they did is they realized if their customers had 3 priority intelligence requirements by the end of onboarding, so by the time they get to that, hey, first time to value, if they had at least 3 priority intelligence requirements identified that they were also ingesting their system data to look at, those customers had a very high likelihood to retain and expand. So they really transformed the whole onboarding process to be about identifying priority intelligence requirements, getting those documented, and proving that we could make meaningful progress against those PIRs, as they call them. Live Action Software. So they're another customer we work with. They're a network monitoring solution. One of the things that was really interesting, right? So they monitor devices on a network. They basically look at those devices and monitor a variety of things in terms of traffic performance, security, a whole variety of different things. And so part of what they realized was customers didn't necessarily want to get all their devices on, but if you didn't get to at least 75% of their devices on the network within 6 months, because there would always be some number of devices that were not utilized. So customers have devices on the network, they weren't really utilizing them. But if you couldn't get to 75% of devices within 6 months, that really became an important tipping point for them, where if you couldn't get there within 6 months, that started to kind of risk later retention and expansion. So a little bit different flavor here in terms of type of company. And then lastly, Tugendo, it's a healthcare software company. The big one for them was, did the chief medical information officer sign off on the implementation? So they have an interesting solution. They sell a workforce management solution for hospitals. And so if the chief medical information officer signs off on the implementation, huge likelihood of retention and expansion. If that person does not sign off, really difficult to come back and then sort of get their buy-in at a later time. And so if you look at these, one of the things I think is interesting about these different examples is that they're all different and they're all based on what that specific organization sells their buyer and how their buyer realizes value from their product. And so, Todd, I think this aligns with something you shared earlier, which is this is something that is deeply specific to your organization. This is not something that you can just lift and shift from somebody else. This requires a level of introspection. This requires a level of thought. And, you know, again, if folks in the audience, if we can help you with this, this is an area that we work with our customers on quite a bit as well. But getting this right really transforms the onboarding process from just something that we're doing to something that really drives a tangible outcome that we can point to say, hey, because the other part of this, right, is if you look at each of these, you can point to your customer and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, I know that you're trying to be successful with our software. If you can get to this outcome within this time frame, we know you're going to be successful and we know you're going to get the value that you originally bought. And that's a hugely powerful and transformative lever in the customer relationship.
Yeah, you know, this brings me back, and maybe you're referencing some of this. I think it's the 4 disciplines of execution.
Yeah, the 4 disciplines of execution is a great book.
And I mean, this is the key to not being too distracted by, I think, what's happening within my customer journey, but really being able to identify the key aspects of what we should focus in on, and versus just kind of shooting around like gut feeling, gut checks. Hey, they're doing good. Hey, they're not doing good. Like the reality is, like what you said, somebody hits 2,000 Slack messages. Yeah, like we know that a 95% chance they're going to stay.
Yeah.
Like there should be no more gut checks around, they're doing good or not. Like these are the accounts that we should be able to expand. And if we haven't, how do we now change that? And
what are we doing? What do we need to do differently to help grow them? Because we know we've got the right foundation in place. Yeah, 100%. Then the so last couple things that we just to put a bow on this, then we'll open up for Q&A and certainly any audience participation we want to have. The other piece is really aligning the technical onboarding and the onboarding experience, right? So if you think about the technical onboarding, it's does the solution work as we intended it, right? Which this is a lot of times what we get focused on is how do we make sure that things technically work properly. And then the second piece is really about creating the experience, which is this somebody we're excited about partnering with? So from a customer perspective, are we excited about partnering with this group? And I'll never forget, we had a customer and we went to one of their onboarding calls, and it was, how do I say this? Very dry. And so one of the things that we worked with them on was really transforming that from a discussion that's just about, hey, here's what we need to do. Here's the how we get your users provisioned. Here's how we get everybody on the system. Here's when we do training, to really transforming that onboarding call and those onboarding discussions to be about, hey, here's the outcome that you're trying to accomplish as an organization. Here's that aspirational vision you're trying to get. Here are the steps that we can take together to accomplish that, you know, in partnership. Here are the things that we need from you. Here are the things we're going to do. And oh, by the way, here's how that ties back to you getting the goal that you told us is really important to you. And just by flipping that, it was really amazing. This sounds like such a simple thing, but just by flipping and retraining their teams on how they had that initial onboarding meeting, their time to value decreased by almost 45 days just by getting the customer excited and kind of creating that why for the customer around why does this matter? What do you need from us as a customer? What is the outcome we're going to get from doing this? And again, it sounds so simple, but like I said, I mean, 45 days in reduction in time to value, that's huge. If you think about from a customer perspective, how much sooner they're getting value, how much sooner we can then, you know, work on expanding them, that makes just a huge difference. And so really focusing on balancing the technical onboarding with creating that great experience can make a huge difference.
A quick question for you, John. What do you see or recommend as far as exposing what those leading indicators are to the customer? So as an example, let's go back to the Slack example. Is it valuable or is it reasonable to have kind of the company goals and work with the customer and say, look, we're trying to do everything humanly possible in the first 30 days to get you to 2,000 messages. That's our goal. Like, is that okay? Or do we kind of,
I think you have to frame it around the customer, right? And the way you do that is you frame it around the customer and say, hey, Todd, you signed with us. Obviously you as our champion want this to be successful. What we have seen working with our customers is that our customers who get to 2,000 messages within 30 days, they see way more value. They see way more adoption. Your life is better in all these ways. And so you flip it around rather than making it just about, hey, we want you to get here because it'll help us retain you. You flip it around and make it about, hey, Todd, we know that you signed with us because you really want to get to this outcome. What we've seen is our customers who can accomplish this in the first 30 days, they see much more value. They get much more X, Y, and Z. And so we want you to have that same kind of experience. So let's organize our plan together to make sure that you get that same sort of outcome. Or even if you think about the HubSpot example, right? You can say, hey, what we see for our customers, that our customers that get the most value out of the platform get at least 5 features put in place over the first 60 days. So let's talk about which 5 are a priority for you based on what you shared. How do we put together a roadmap to make sure that you can work this into your plan so that you're ultimately going to get that value? So I think it's good to share it, but you make it customer centric and focused on them getting their outcome. It's even better if you can come back and say, hey, here's what you told us you want to accomplish in the sales process. For you to get there, here's the roadmap, and then sort of blending those things together.
That's awesome. Because
I think exposing it to the customer, but in a customer centric way, can be really powerful.
But if you don't have it, there's no way to eloquently.
Well, if you don't have it, there's no way to elevate the conversation beyond this sort of tactical. Here's how we get your users provisioned.
Yeah.
And so that makes a huge difference. And then, but to your original question, I think framing it as about the customer versus about us is kind of the key there.
Yep.
And makes a big difference. So just in conclusion, right? Sort of five key things. So creating a clear value realization framework. Secondly, nailing the sales handshake. Third, making onboarding all about achieving your leading indicator of retention expansion. Fourth, balancing kind of your technical onboarding with your onboarding experience. And then fifth, automating those routine tasks. And so, I think, I don't want to do too much of a commercial for you here, but I think to the extent to which you can take that project management, right? Because none of us, we've all been in implementations where everything's managed by spreadsheet and it's very taxing. And to the extent to which you can automate those routine tasks so that you can allow your onboarding teams, your customer success teams to really focus on that customer engagement aspect, because there is a level to this, right? Which is about humans connecting with humans. And for all the things that we can automate, for all the things that we can do, the more that we can automate those routine tasks so we can focus more on, how do we foster that relationship development? How do we find out the wins for those people on the customer side can make a big difference.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, thank you. This has been enlightening for me. I've definitely learned some good takeaways for me. If there's any other questions, there's been a couple of questions that have been thrown out here on the chat, but happy to go to more of a live. Looks like we just got another question here from Amanda. What sort of data and indicators do people generally start with when identifying their leading indicators or retention and expansion?
So a couple things. So one is, usually people will start with kind of a macro data set around. So there's a couple things that I recommend. So one is, the best place to start is actually look at customers that have been with us for a long time and retained. And so start with here are the customers that we have retained and expanded a lot with. Then I recommend doing 2 things. There's a data piece to this, but sometimes the data doesn't tell the full story. And so there's sort of a quantitative, qualitative aspect to this, which is, one is we want to look at the data from those accounts and everything from, I think you mentioned service tickets, retention, utilization trends can be another big one. Are there utilization trends across those folks? The other thing that can be really helpful is to go back and talk to the CSMs, the onboarding teams, the account executives that work with those accounts. Because for example, the example we shared about 75% of devices on the network, that one was actually really easy to pull from data because you looked at customers that had retained a lot. They were all 75% plus. You look at customers that had churned, they were all 75% lower. If you think about the example we shared around Recorded Future, where they were identifying priority intelligence requirements, they actually gathered a lot of that info by talking with the CSMs and the teams. And they said, okay, well, what do these accounts have in common? All these accounts had at least 3 priority intelligence requirements when they left onboarding. So in that case, it was actually talking to the teams and kind of ferreting that out. So what I recommend is actually a combination of data look at, but also go do some qualitative research with the teams, because sometimes what you'll learn actually as the commonality has a lot more to do with things that are not immediately visible in the data, if that makes sense.
No, that's great.
But first and foremost, start with the customers that start with the customer, start with a small set of customers that we noticed we've retained or expanded with quite a bit, and then work backwards from that customer data set. Awesome. Well, Todd, I really appreciate you having us. So a couple things. One is somebody asked about the deck. I will send this to Stacy and Todd. I think they'll send it out to everybody who registered. We really appreciate everybody, your time, attention today. Appreciate you being together with us. And then certainly here's my contact info. If there's anything that we can do to be helpful for you, you've got my contact info. Also connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to help any of you however we can. And most importantly, everybody have a wonderful holiday season.
Well, thank you so much, John. Once again, a wealth of knowledge, gold nuggets coming from every different direction.
All from the School of Hard Knocks. So none of it, all of it learned through many experiences. So
That's
we appreciate.
You didn't want to go do the asphalt every morning.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I learned at an early age that asphalt paving is a very difficult profession. So yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you so much. Just to echo what John was saying, happy holidays to everybody. Be safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.